This interview was incredibly risky. This case is now playing out in the media as opposed to in the courtroom. And the risk in any case is that anything that's said in an interview, in the media, no matter what the medium, it can come back into the courtroom and be used as fodder for cross-examination. So all of these inconsistencies, which clearly the plaintiff side wanted to get this narrative out in the public sphere, but those inconsistencies are going to be exploited when it comes time for a trial, when it comes time for testimony. And so sitting down outside the courtroom is often a very, very risky decision to make. This is such a high profile case. And with every single legal filing, there's so much attention and scrutiny on not only the claims, but the response from the defendants. So everything is playing out very publicly. It's likely that the plaintiff's attorney, Tony Busby, sat down and made a calculated risk, thinking that getting this narrative out, addressing these inconsistencies right at the very beginning, before they're hoodwinked with them later, was an appropriate path for this particular case with all of the attention. That being said, it's always going to be a balance test of risk versus reward. Clearly here, they thought the benefit outweighs the risk and moved forward with the interview. First, just because there are inconsistencies in the plaintiff's story doesn't necessarily mean the allegations are false. This is a case that's over 20 years old. The incident at issue happened in the year 2000. With any case of this age, it can be difficult to get corroborating evidence, to find witnesses, memories fade. And that's true also of the plaintiff. In this particular case, these inconsistencies could be attributed to the lapse of time and also some medical issues that she's raised. So her medical conditions could play into this case in a way to explain why maybe she doesn't have a memory of some facts or why there's been inconsistencies in her story over time. So that could absolutely be a component of the case, because in a civil case, she will testify. She has to testify, and everything will come down to credibility. Any inconsistencies in her story will be hammered on cross-examination, and the jury is going to want to hear why the story may have evolved over time, and this would be an explanation. That being said, from a defense perspective, it is her burden to prove the case. A plaintiff has the burden to prove the case by a preponderance of the evidence. And so when there are inconsistencies in the story and the story has changed as time has gone on, that is something the defense will absolutely jump on. And the argument will be, why would you believe one aspect of her story, which is necessary in order to be successful in the courtroom, when she's proven to have given false information, whether it be intentionally or not, with respect to other aspects of the story? It's a phrase, falsus in uno, falsus in omnibus. False in one thing, false in everything. And that's what the defense will say to the jury at the end of the trial. We all read the complaint. We all saw what was in that document, that the plaintiff is the one to provide that information. And it's verified, meaning that she sat down and said, this is a true and accurate account of what happened in this incident. And that was filed with the court. Now we already see her walking back on some of those allegations, and two that are incredibly critical. First, that her father picked her up from a gas station after this alleged terrible incident occurred. He's come out and affirmatively said he does not remember that happening, and he thinks he would remember that if it were true. That is incredibly damaging. Not only do you have an allegation that's being directly refuted by another individual, that individual is her father. If there was ever going to be incentive to come out in support of someone, you would think it would be a parent to the child. And so that is going to be incredibly damaging to her account of the events that night. The other is saying that she had a conversation, a specific conversation with Benji Madden, and now come out and said that he was on tour in the Midwest during that time period. So it could not have happened. That's going to be easily verifiable that he was not there and he was out of the state at that time. So all of that is really creating a cloud over her story. And that's because The plaintiff has that burden to prove their case, and those inconsistencies tend to show that some of the story is objectively not true. What could work in her favor is that there's going to be a continued aspect of fact finding. There's going to be evidence that the lawyers are going to look for. Her lawyer is going to look for corroborating evidence. And so to the extent that that exists, whether there's video, telephone calls, text messages, whatever it might be, that is something that could help her prove her case. Her word alone is unlikely to carry the day. But if there's other corroborative evidence or other witnesses, that could be something that would inure to her benefit. When we're talking about a party after the VMAs in New York, it's not going to be difficult to find out who was in attendance. Even though the allegations are from 20 years ago, there's bound to be a record of who was in attendance at that party. Once those individuals are spoken to, perhaps there's witnesses that can corroborate that she was in fact there. Those are the types of things that could inure to her benefit in the courtroom.
So Shawn Carter and his team have always denied everything, and they've already moved to dismiss this lawsuit. What do you think are the chances of that actually happening here?
I wasn't surprised to see a motion to dismiss filed. This is what happens when you have scorched earth litigation. You pull out all the stops. That being said, an early dismissal of a case with these types of allegations is very unlikely. That's because the court looks at the standard of whether or not there's a question of fact. That means there's two different sides to the story. That's not an issue for the court to determine. That's for a jury. And that's why you see these cases where there's different sides of the story, making it all the way to trial, because that's the critical question that only a jury can answer. The next steps that happen in the courtroom is the discovery process. This is when depositions are taken, documents and information are exchanged between the parties. We're going to learn a lot about the case, a lot about whether or not there's corroborating evidence, and a lot about the defense as that process unfolds. The most important aspect being the deposition of the plaintiff. What is that going to say? That is taken under oath. So all of these inconsistencies that are being pointed out in the media, that's something that's going to be explored during the deposition. And that's where we're really going to have an idea of what's going to happen at that trial. Polygraph tests are generally not admissible in court. And so it's unlikely to really move the needle one way or the other as far as her case and how it plays out in litigation. Seems like the reason to do a polygraph test is more of this playing out in the court of public opinion and providing the results of a polygraph test in the media or in a public way in order to corroborate the allegations. Now, that might have an impact on the way the case is viewed from the perspective of us watching the news and consuming information about the case, but it's not going to matter when it comes down to a jury and what they decide. First of all, taking a polygraph test can be a risk as well because you could fail it. And they won't know the results until the test is actually taken. And since she's also raised medical issues that could impact her ability to actually sit for the test, there would always be concern about how credible the test actually is. Now, that's the reason why polygraph tests are generally not admissible in court, because there's concerns regarding their veracity and the credibility of the process itself. So if she were to take the test and there were to be an issue with it, perhaps it doesn't come out accurately, they would have a decision about whether or not to release those results publicly. The plaintiff claims to have autism and also to have a head injury. This could play into the case in multiple ways. First, it could explain why her story has changed over time or why there have been inconsistencies. Again, you're talking 20 years ago. And so having these other medical issues could be something that explains why the story has changed. And the jury's going to need to hear that. It also could relate to the damages element of the case. In any civil case, a plaintiff is also required not only to prove liability, meaning that this conduct, these allegations, in fact, occurred, but also to prove damages. To do that, medical history is paramount. And so any of these alleged medical issues that she's experienced throughout her life could be an element of damages. Her medical history is going to be a large part of the case, and that's because a plaintiff is required to prove damages. So autism and a head injury, it's unlikely that she'll argue that those were caused by the allegations in the complaint, but she could argue that her conditions were exacerbated by the stress, anxiety, and other mental health issues that resulted from the alleged conduct. And that's how a plaintiff would go forward proving damages.
Any chance that the lawyers for Sean Combs and Shawn Carter could be working together in all of this?
Both Combs and Carter are defendants in this case, and both have come out and denied the allegations. Behind the scenes, their legal teams could actually be working together to gather information and evidence to support the defense of the case. To the extent that they're aligned on refuting these allegations, oftentimes defense attorneys have joint defense agreements where they work together to leverage a defense position against the plaintiff. With this civil case, it's going to proceed in the courtroom, go through the discovery process, and maybe ultimately make it to trial, unless it settles somewhere along the way, which is something that happens very often in civil litigation. That being said, there's a huge part of this case that cannot be ignored. It's that Combs is facing a criminal trial for sex trafficking and RICO violations. That is going to take priority over any of the civil cases against him. What's likely to happen is his legal team will seek a stay, meaning put the pause button on for all of these civil cases and wait until the criminal case plays out. That's because they have to prioritize the criminal case, which at the end of the day, that is about someone's freedom, as opposed to these cases, which are about a monetary award. We do know that a grand jury convened again relating to Combs. Now, that could mean a superseding indictment. That would be potential additional charges. It could be additional alleged victims. And it's unclear right now what overlaps with these civil cases. If there is a superseding indictment, we may see that the feds actually investigated some of these claims through the prism of federal charges as opposed to civil litigation. So there could absolutely be overlap between what happens at the criminal case and these civil cases that are playing out. The defense is posturing this case very, very well at these early stages. It's very clear that they had found out information to refute her allegations. So right now, they're coming into this case with a position of power. Because she ultimately has to prove her case, it's going to be up to the plaintiff's side to find that corroborating information if it exists. The defense has done an excellent job of grabbing onto all of these inconsistencies and really going full speed ahead to show that at least part of her story is not true. And they're showing that with objective facts. That's going to be very helpful to them as this case unfolds and when it goes before a jury.